everyone. For the sake of time, let's just start. How is everyone? My name is Maria Azul Schwartzman. I am an engagement manager at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and I will be moderating this session. So for those of you who don't know, we will be working today on just transition indicators for next-gen NDCs. And as all of you might be aware, the concept of just transition is gaining a lot of traction in the global stage, but its practical implications are facing some challenges. So in this press conference, what we will try to do is address the growing need for clear metrics to track just transition efforts, particularly as countries are presenting their new NDCs and also their long-term low-emission strategies. So first of all, I would like to introduce to you to Vicky Seens. She's the Decarbonization and Energy Transformation Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And Vicky, for you, I have a question on what role do just transition metrics play in your view and from WBA's perspective? How are companies implementing just transition plans? And is there any guidance on how to better assess these plans?
Thank you, Maria, and hi, everyone. Indeed, my name is Vicky, and I represent the World Benchmarking Alliance today, where we really look at what is the role of the private sector in order to really drive the just transition integration into the transition plans. So ever since 2021, the organization I represent, so the WBA, we've been looking into what type of metrics and indicators are needed to actually assess the role of the private sector into driving this transition forward. So first of all, we said there is a need to look at the social transformation as a whole as an integrating part of the transition to a low-carbon economy. On the one hand, we said we need to operationalize the UN guiding principles, so really looking into what is the role of the private sector into integrating the adherence to human rights policy, human rights remedies, but also how are they acting ethically. This very much speaks to paying fair taxes where they're based, and also what is the role of the private sector in providing decent work. These are the core principles and the core metrics that we've used, and from that we have expanded into identifying the need for companies to start planning for a just transition. And what do we mean with that? Is that initially we said we expect companies to have a credible transition plan looking into emission reduction and in investments in new technologies, etc., but also what are these plans, how are they impacting the communities that they've built, and how are they impacting their workforce. So we expect the companies to do an assessment of that and then identify potential plans that are needed in order to make sure that workforce doesn't get stranded, but also communities doesn't get stranded. Then I think it is very important to highlight that what we say is that it's not the role of the companies or the private sector to solve, the results of that assessment, but it is very important that the companies make transparent about what are their plans for implementation. But then the next step is that they mobilize stakeholder dialogue, so all the stakeholders that are involved and affected need to be part of then identifying what is the financial implication of this transition. Then the next step is how are we going to plan for that transition. So if there is new skill development that is needed, if there is a transition of workforce that is needed, if there's implication from the supply chain that have been built alongside of this company, then it is important to get the right stakeholders around the table. As I mentioned, since 2021, we have been assessing a lot of companies. So far, we have assessed 450 companies in different industries, and you can think about the building sector, the transport sector, oil and gas, electric utilities, heavy industries, so cement, steel, aluminium. And we also then assessed these companies on these social indicators. What we have seen is that really integrating the climate piece and the social piece for companies is still a very challenging topic. It's often treated as two isolated topics within the company, and it is really important that we keep on advocating and accelerating with companies to need to really integrate these two in one strategic plan. We've also seen that with the assessments that we've done so far is that there's no one company that does all of these things. The good news is that there are some good practices that are being identified. We also try to highlight these good practices so that companies can learn from each other and can learn from best practices from their competitors. What we also see is that, of course, like with other elements and the push for getting a more regional and localized approach, and my colleagues here on the table will also go in more depth on that. There is a need, of course, to have very site-specific implementation, regional implementations, but the core stays with it needs to be embedded in a governance structure in a company, that it is good practice, that any strategic planning that a company does starts to integrate these social implications into a strategic vision on how are we as a company navigating into a transitioning world. We talk about the new NDCs, which are very, of course, the ones that we've seen so far are being applauded. We hear a lot of the narrative around a whole of economy approach, but definitely want to make sure that we keep this whole of society approach. The NDCs are a compass for a country to really navigate into an action plan for the country, and companies and private sector need to be at the core of that table in terms of implementation, but it should not be forgotten in terms of what it is that we want to do as a social transformation for the country. What do we need the private sector to do, and in terms of how are we really translating this ambition into action, but we really need to make sure that the right stakeholders are around the table to really make this implemented on a local and regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And now I'd like to introduce Jonas Kuhl. He's a policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And Jonas, for you, linking the role of just transition metrics to international and national climate objectives, can you tell us a bit more about the importance of monitoring and evaluation systems for just transition, and what does this mean in the new cycle of NDCs?
Thank you very much for this question, and I'm also very happy to be here today. So, as you rightly said, I'm a researcher for ISD, but we also have some work where we actually set up a knowledge hub on just energy transition. So that kind of brings together a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different information to one place. I just wanted to use that opportunity to mention this here. So, of course, if we be very happy to speak about this link between just transition and the national climate objectives, and also what that means for the NDCs. So obviously the key reason for tracking progress on this topic is to determine whether there's sufficient action has been actually taken towards the desired outcomes, and therefore in practice in any policy field. And that is not different also for this discussion on just transition. So as just transition has, what we kind of observe, has moved from being more like a co-benefit of this transition to something that is more a prerequisite or a precondition. We think this is more than ever more important to also talk about metrics and tracking progress on just transition. So it particularly speaks about the procedural element of justice, as obviously just with the information available on the impacts of the transition and whether the policy interventions that governments carrying out, and also other sectors and other players like businesses, this will give all the stakeholders actually the information, and that is the only way for ensuring some inclusive engagements on this topic. I just want to add that just transition must be reflective of the different national circumstances, as Vicky just mentioned. So also tracking any progress must be grounded on these national and local monitoring systems or frameworks. And I just want to speak a little bit what we have seen in terms of what action governments have been taking so far on this topic. So we see that so far there's only very few governments that have actually integrated just transition and progress tracking on this topic into their national plans. So there's a few countries that mention it, they mention the need for it, but we also even less have seen countries actually already compiling what are the relevant indicators, how can this tracking and framework look like. And as ISD, we have been quite comprehensively also tracking the NDCs in terms of how much just transition is reflected there. So we see that there's actually only like 44 NDCs that mention just transition specifically. And from these, there's actually only 12 NDCs that have like specific chapters and specific chapters on this topic of just transition, but only this type of information would allow to actually go more deeper into the topic and provide that information that is relevant. So we have been looking at this, particularly more like explicit mentioning of just transition, but we also have looked at how are different elements of just transition reflected in NDCs. So we see that some forms and some elements that we consider important for just transition, let it be gender equality, poverty eradication, skills and training, those are more widely reflected in the countries' NDCs than other relevant topics for just transition, particularly economic diversification, social protection, but also, and most notably also, social dialogue. So we also think that just tracking progress, measuring, monitoring are relevant, is a relevant element that also should be included in these NDCs. And because, that will help and provide the transparency that is needed, as I mentioned already above. So when looking at the NDCs that countries have already put out, so these are we have looked at all the active NDCs. There's a few good examples where countries actually mention specific elements of monitoring, of indicators, of tracking progress on just transition. So I just name a few here to enrich that discussion. So Chile, for example, committed to establish a mechanism to measure, report, and verify the application of the criteria that they have as part of their social pillar, which includes just transition. Antigua and Barbuda, they had three very concrete targets that they mentioned that they would, under the just transition pillar, they would like to achieve by 2030. So one of them is, for example, a 50% increase in SMMEs that are working on, that are providing energy services. And then there's other countries like Colombia or Costa Rica that also commit that their just transition strategies that they are developing will also include indicators of application and that then will make it possible for course correction. So Costa Rica, for example, specifically mentions also that there needs to be the specific functions in the national climate change metric systems to actually develop the data and gather the data that is required for implementing these frameworks. So we also see, I've been mainly focusing on NDCs, but also on the long-term strategies. We also see countries, South Africa or Indonesia, that mention specific elements where there's monitoring plans and where there's specific strategies where these countries want to move forward on monitoring and evaluation of their actions and their impacts on just transition. So, but I mainly wanted to focus on the NDCs here. So, just being said that, with the new round of NDCs coming up, we really see that this is an opportunity for countries to get active, and that is an opportunity that they should not forego. And we really see that just transition needs to be strengthened, like, across the different topics that I mentioned, but the monitoring and evaluation is one of those. And we want to see countries stepping up and providing more information, what are their plans, and also how concretely they would like to implement this. So I wanted to conclude with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonas. Now I would like to introduce Johnny Ann Wang. She's a Global Policy Fellow in Sustainable Finance at the Grantham Institute of the London School of Economics. So, Jody Ann, for you, what do you see as the role of net zero policy in driving non-state climate action? And what does this mean in the context of a just transition? And also, what might be some of the ways to address the cross-border dimensions of justice?
Thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here. Earlier this year, we conducted a research at the LSE looking at how this idea of justice is being articulated by countries in their different policy packages, not only in the NDCs, but in sectoral policies, in the development plan, in their climate action plan, budget spending bills, etc. That was across more than 150 countries. And what we found firstly is that this idea of justice is being kind of contemplated quite differently across countries, some with kind of distributive justice and procedural justice being the main element that most countries had articulated. Kind of out of the 150-something policies, 130 of them did articulate the need for procedural justice, and 60 of them articulated the need for procedural justice. But other types like ecological, restorative, intergenerational, much less. And with that different kind of contemplation, what it leads to is a different type of policies that are then implemented to meet different ideas of change. Some are more transformational and others are more kind of status quo, managerial, and relying on more kind of market-based mechanisms. But what we found on the back of that report is there's a kind of a very obvious omission of cross-border impacts of the just transition. And put simply is how one country's transition can create justice outcomes or severe injustices in another country. And this you can follow the global value chain mostly happening upstream. And that's something that we really need policy design and implementation and evaluation to take into account, to give legal recourses to affected communities upstream so that they can hold non-state actors accountable when injustices do occur. We tracked mostly, we used, and that report, which we call Interconnected Justice, was launched earlier this week with the Task Force of Net Zero Policy. And we're very lucky to have supported the task force in writing this report, which was launched by the UN Secretary General on the 13th at a high-level event this week. In that report, we looked at kind of give example of disclosure and due diligence policies, as those are kind of the two transparency-based policy packages that are coming to the fore in guiding non-state actors' action. And in that, kind of we're seeing engagement as a key pillar that are guiding non-state actors to do more on justice. We're also seeing kind of principles like do no significant harm being drawing the red line. But what we're trying to say is engagement itself risk being a checkbox exercise if they're not designed properly, as kind of colleagues earlier mentioned, and that there's kind of operational and temporal limits to it as well. If we're trying to engage with upstream of the value chain, how many times, what is the outcome, and those can be reflected in the qualitative elements of metrics disclosure. But also when it comes to do no significant harm, we really want to see non-state actors moving beyond kind of a compliance-based of doing no injustices, but actually how do you affect more good in the process of the transition. And we currently we're not yet seeing examples of policies that are guiding towards that doing more good and not just simply avoiding injustices, because we know that that's not enough when the global kind of economic system itself is already uneven in the first place. So hoping to see more of that coming to the fore as well, and very much kind of welcome insights and comments and ideas as we kind of try to start socializing this idea of interconnected justice. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jody. Are there any questions from the audience at this time? Okay. Yes. Can we give a mic? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very insightful presentations. My question is regarding all this push for transparency, monitoring, reporting of just transitions indicators. Sometimes transparency can be criticized for or like these disclosure practices can be criticized for obscuring sometimes like the contextualities of just transitions, because they vary across context, not only at a national level, but also at regional levels, especially with non-state actors. So I was wondering, how do you see that can be addressed, or those concerns regarding disclosure and monitoring and reporting that are widely out there?
Jodiane, do you want to take that question?
I can come in first and then Vicky. Yeah, I think two things I want to highlight, which is that in these indicators, they can be quantitative and qualitative, right? So we really, you cannot economize, you cannot render just transition to a single number, and I think that's very clear in kind of all of the research that we've been doing. So there's a qualitative contextual element to it as well. And in our latest thinking when it comes to metrics and indicators, there's three different layers to it. You have the foundational and the contextual, and then kind of the asset or project specific. Foundational being kind of what are you, kind of the global realities in which we're operating in and the systemic inequalities that exist in the first place. And the contextual is kind of the lived realities of the region or the community in which we're trying to measure justice outcomes. And then at the asset and project level is kind of the site-specific, nuanced implementation factors that we need to take into account.
Yeah, I think maybe to add to Joanne, because I think you said it really well, but I think so far what we've seen is that often the transparency comes not from the voluntary or mandatory disclosure that companies have done, but mostly because something has happened that has, asks for a remedy or asks for a response. And I think companies should, that's at least what we're advocating for, is push to be transparent around what policies do they have in place and how are they going about, if something happens, how are they going to restore, or how are they going to implement improvements along their value chains. I think if you look at the companies that we have assessed so far, often the ones that are doing better are those that have experienced a severe incident, either with employees or in their communities that they operate in, and they have then been forced by external stakeholders as well, because pressure has been put on these companies to then be transparent around how they do better. What we try to then now emphasize is, especially because it is a very complicated topic, and as you can hear here, it is very contextualized, it's very regionalized, it crosses borders, it's sometimes a very long supply chains that need to be addressed. We try to emphasize is that can there be a transparent view about the implications of this transition, and can we have that open dialogue around what needs to happen, not only by the companies about being transparent, but by other stakeholders stepping up to the table as well. And that hopefully we do that by highlighting the things that have been done in the past and things that do go well in certain countries. That doesn't mean that everything in every country is sorted, but just showing certain examples hopefully then inspires others to be transparent around as well. I think for us it's about the transparent part is where we have a concern, because then we don't know what happens, and then it's waiting for an incident to happen. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add very briefly, because many of the things that I actually wanted to say have been said, is that really the importance of the context and that what is the objective of monitoring this. So it's what we see, it is not the objective to then be able to say, okay, Australia does better than Canada and India is worse, but it's really about seeking this system that works for the context in a specific country or even in a specific region, because these transitions are often also very regional. So I just wanted to stress that element, that of the purpose of the monitoring system and why it's actually why we want this transparency. It is not to, it is really to see how is it going, how is the transition going in a specific context, but not how is it going compared necessarily to other places where also transitions are happening. So just wanted to add this point.
Thank you, colleagues. Are there any other quick questions from the audience? Otherwise, because we're running out of time, I would like to open the floor for like a 30-second reflection from each of you of this conversation. So, Vicky?
I think there's encouraging signals about the negotiation of including the just transition language in the negotiated text. And I really hope that everyone here is keep pushing that the just transition is being acknowledged as an integral part of the discussions and also the new NDCs being published. So anyone who has influence over that, please keep pushing your ambition of the most ambitious outcome.
Yeah, likewise here, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's countries that have already done and included these elements on monitoring and evaluation and tracking progress in their NDCs. So we really want now with this process still ongoing, we hope that there's more coming out from the new NDCs that will be published over the next year. And we really hope that these topics will be one of the very relevant elements in those trust transition sections that we generally want to see being buffed up.
I think two things. One is that we talked a lot about transparency here, but it's quite important to state that policies work best when they're implemented in mixes. So while we have transparency-based policies, we also need kind of more hardline behavior-based actions as well, and policies play a huge role in changing that behavior. And the second thing is kind of we need to look at commitment, implementation, and outcome separately. It's one thing to commit, it's another thing to allocate resources and to act and to provide the trainings. And the third thing is the outcome. Sometimes the outcome might be different from what was intended or what was implemented, and oftentimes that difference happens in a cross-border manner. So redressal is also extremely important when we're thinking about just transition.
Thank you very much. We're wrapping up and running out of time, so thank you everyone for being here, and if you want to continue the conversation, we can take it outside. Thank you, colleagues.